May I speak in the name of God, who is our Creator, our Redeemer, and our Sustainer. In the passage from John's Gospel that we've just heard, Jesus tells us that if we have faith in him and love him, then he is in us and we are in him, and he will send his Spirit to guide us and to comfort us. I think that's a truth well worth holding on to as we live through these very strange times. I'm going to be looking in more detail today at the passage from Acts, but before we look at that, let's have a quick recap about what Sally was saying last week. If you remember, we heard about Stephen being dragged outside the walls of Jerusalem and stoned to death for proclaiming the gospel. Sally pointed out that all through the Bible, people had been called on by God to do things which they thought were impossible. And very often, their reaction was to try and run away. But Stephen didn't run away. Stephen did what was asked of him, proclaiming the gospel to the very moment of his death. I wonder if I'd have been any good in his position. So moving to today's reading from Acts, we're with St. Paul. And of course, eventually, the gospel cost him his life too. But the really incredible thing about Paul is that he was called upon very simply to take the gospel to the world. A gargantuan task. How could anybody even begin to think it was possible or formulate a plan of how to manage it? But Paul did. His usual way of working as he went to a new city was to find the local Jewish community. And there were the people who already knew the scriptures. And with the people who had been born Jewish, there would also be very often quite a number of Gentiles who were drawn to Judaism because it seemed so much more sensible to have one God who loves you rather than a plethora of gods who couldn't give a monkey's uncle about anyone. But Paul's difficulty in Athens was that there was no Jewish community. So he had to find another way in. To use the modern phrase, he needed a culturally appropriate approach. And he found it. Paul, of course, was Jewish, but born in Tarsus and therefore a Roman citizen. His family was well enough off to educate him both in the Jewish scriptures and to give him a Greek education. And despite the fact this was the Roman Empire, the main language around the Mediterranean, the one that everybody used to communicate, was Greek. And Greek education was highly prized. And Greek education taught you how to debate. And those are the skills that Paul used in Athens. He started with a compliment. I can see that you're a very religious city. You have so many temples. There's even one to an unknown God. That, of course, famously was his way in. And at that point, he must have been sorely tempted to do a deep dive into the scriptures. But he didn't. He kept the touch light. He used all his skills of oratory. He quoted Greek poets. And he gained the interest of a small, but nonetheless significant group of people. 2 of them are even named, which means they must have been quite important people in Athens. Did it work? Did Paul's sowing of seeds reap any harvest? Well, if you've ever had the privilege of visiting Athens, you'll know that almost every other building is a church building. Yes, it worked. Athens became a Christian city. Not overnight, but it did become a Christian city. So Paul had found a new way of working, a culturally appropriate way of getting the gospel to people who didn't even know that there was just the one God. And that started me wondering, what's culturally appropriate in 21st century Hertford Heath? Well, Paul's helpful again. His letter to the Ephesians is useful because he lists the gifts of the Spirit. He mentions being an apostle, being an evangelist, being a prophet, or a pastor, or a teacher. But I don't think the list is supposed to be exhaustive. Thinking about our church family in Hertford Heath, I thought, what about the people who are good listeners? We have a lot of those. What about the people who are very sociable, very good at getting other people to talk to each other, discuss things, interact? What about the people who pick up on small details and make those quiet phone calls because somebody didn't seem quite themselves? And what about those people who are just plain cheerful, who never stop smiling and just lift your day? They are all gifts that we possess in our church family in Hertford Heath. And they are all important gifts. If we'd had all the readings for today, we'd have had a passage from the first letter of Peter as well, in which Peter would have suggested that one of the best ways to evangelise is to live a Christian life. Live in a way that shows how important God is to you, how much better your life is with God. And then when people ask questions, you can answer them. And here's where that passage from John's Gospel comes back. God's Spirit is with us, and you will have the words you need to tell other people why God is important to you. Because Jesus sent his Spirit to us to help us and comfort us, but also so that we could help and comfort others and bring them to him. Amen.